Hello, 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 and welcome back to Spin Cycle Live. I'm your host, Nathan Hale. Today, my God, do we get a lot of Supreme Court rulings coming down the pike today. This entire episode is going to be a Supreme Court episode, for that matter. We have no other stories to cover today other than Supreme Court rulings. You know, I try to keep this show during a half an hour for you all because I know you're busy people. I'm a busy person myself. I don't like to ramble on forever, even though I totally could. So we got a lot of Supreme Court cases to go over. There was plenty of other news that happened today, but by far the biggest were the Supreme Court cases we got. I believe we have 4 that we're looking at in total today with 5 total stories. Please go and look up what else happened in the news today. It is out there. Go and follow me on X to see all my takes on everything that's happening right now. That's probably the best place to hear about all the other things that I think are important to be covering today is over there. So you're not following me on X already, go follow me there. If you're not subscribed to this show on YouTube and Rumble, also go and subscribe over there. YouTube and Rumble, I think, are a much better viewing experience for this show than on X. You're not watching on your little smartphone. You can watch it on your TV or your iPad, whatever that is. Something that you don't have the X app on right now. So go and follow me over there. Subscribe to me on those channels, and tweet at me on X. Let me know what's happening, what the show should be doing more of. If there's a certain way that you like this show formatted, let me know. Send me a message on there. Let me know what you like, what you don't like, and make sure you share this all with your followers, with your friends. Let people know that Nathan Hale has the best opinions on the internet. But with that, let's get into our very first episode, or our very first story today, and that comes from Fox News. So SCOTUS rules on Trump's birthright citizenship order, testing lower courts' powers. Supreme Court on Friday delivered a major victory in President Donald Trump's quest to block lower courts from issuing universal injunctions that had upended many of his administration's executive orders and actions. Justices ruled 6-3, no surprise there, to allow the lower courts to issue injunctions only in limited instances though the ruling leaves open the question of how the ruling will apply to the birthright citizenship order at the heart of the case. Supreme Court agreed this year to take up a trio of consolidated cases involving so-called universal injunctions handed down by federal district judges in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Washington state. Judges in those districts had blocked Trump's ban on birthright citizenship from taking force nationwide, which the Trump administration argued in their appeal to the Supreme Court was overly broad. Supreme Court arguments in May forced little on the merits of those universal injunctions, and on Friday, the court made it clear that it is not ruling on whether the birthright citizenship orders are constitutional. That's the most important part of this, other than was previously stated with all the injunctions. This was not the birthright citizenship case. This was about if federal courts can issue injunctions. So we'll talk about that more in just a minute. So stick with me here. Instead, it instructed the lower courts to more expeditiously to ensure that with respect to each plaintiff, the injunctions comport with this rule and otherwise comply with principles of equity. Quote, the applications do not raise, and thus we do not address the question whether the executive order violates the Citizenship Clause or Nationality Act, Justice Amy Coney Barrett said, writing for the majority, quote, the issue before us is on the remedy, whether under the Judiciary Act of 1798, federal courts have equitable authority to issue universal injunctions. A universal injunction can be justified only as an exercise of equitable authority, yet Congress has granted federal courts no such power, she added. Justice Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson dissented in the case. So you can go and read the full case if you want to. It's linked in the description in the Fox News article, link in the description on YouTube and Rumble. Sonia Sotomayor, in a scathing dissent, characterized the decision as, quote, nothing less than an open invitation for the government to bypass the Constitution. the executive branch can now enforce policies that flout settled law and violate countless individuals' constitutional rights, and the federal courts will be hamstrung to stop its action fully, until the day that every affected person manages to become part to a lawsuit and secures for himself injunctive relief. The government may act lawlessly indefinitely. Not even a decision from this court would necessarily, she said. In the separate dissent, Jackson wrote that the decision from the majority, quote, will disproportionately impact the poor and uneducated and unpopular, i.e., those who may not have the wherewithal to lawyer up and will all too often find themselves beholden to the executive's whims. All right. So, let's talk about this case for a minute. I think we can all agree that it's ridiculous for the lower courts, the lower federal district court judges, by the way, there's thousands of them, to issue just an injunction on whatever the president says he or she wants to do just because they feel like it. Right, for no real reason. So my understanding what this court case is basically saying is that hey, there has to be some actual merit that comes across. There has to be a case that is brought before a federal court that has, you know, a lot of standing. You know, I'm not a constitutional attorney, so I'm relying on what the media is saying about this. But essentially, the court has said, hey, you can't just put an injunction on an executive action or executive order for whatever reason you want, right? Which I think is great. I don't think they should be able to have that authority. I don't think that some federal judge in Washington State should be able to determine if birthright citizenship does go in fact against the Constitution, you know, so I would say the Achilles heel of this is that, hey, the next Democrat that's going to be president is going to have an enormous amount of executive power going into their term, and the courts will not really have anything to say about it until it really makes it up higher, or there are some serious ramifications happening. This also means that, hey, if a president does something that is seriously unconstitutional, such as take away your guns, for that matter, the lower courts can't just pump the brakes anymore on that and say, hey, let's stop. Let's revisit when we have, you know, a more formal setting to determine that is constitutional. So we're relying a lot more now that the people that we elect will make fair and reasonable decisions when enacting law and justice in the United States. If that'll happen or not, yet to be seen. So we'll see there, but I fear that this will bite conservatives in the butt with this whole case. Now, in the short term, it's going to be great. It just matters that someone who doesn't abuse executive power doesn't end up in office again, right? And we'll see if that actually happens or not. It's likely that it will. Generally, people who run for president are very power hungry. So be prepared. And be prepared that when the lower courts can no longer step in to pump the brakes on an executive action, it was the Trump administration's fault for that. For arguing against this. Now, I'm in favor of this. I really don't have an issue with this. I don't think that an executive, that a lower court should be able to just stop an executive action for just out of nowhere. I don't think they have the authority to do so, but I can see how there could be negatives from that. So that's all I have to say about that one. Let's go move on to our next one. So SCOTUS conservatives issue scathing rebuke of Justice Jackson in injunctions ruling. So this is kind of a follow-up to the previous story we were talking about. So the Supreme Court's Friday ruling narrowing the scope of judicial injunctions also include a scathing rebuke of Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, asserting she sought an imperial judiciary and that her views ran afoul of more than 200 years of precedent. Quote, "We will not dwell on Justice Jackson's argument, which is at odds with more than 2 centuries worth of precedent, not to mention the Constitution itself. We observe only this. Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary," wrote Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Quote, "Justice Jackson would do well to heed her own admonition. Quote, everyone from the president on down is bound by law, a bid that goes for justices too," she added. The justices found that Congress had not given lower court justices the authority to impose nationwide injunctions and that they were unnecessary for the courts to provide relief to plaintiff parties. While the ruling was a clear win for the Trump administration, Barrett's choice words for Jackson appear to signal a growing frustration between conservative justices and their newest colleague. Quote, "Rhetoric aside, Justice Jackson's position is difficult to pin down. She might be arguing that universal injunctions are appropriate, even required, whenever the defendant is part of the executive branch," Barrett wrote. "If so, her position goes far beyond the mainstream defense of universal injunctions." Quote, "As best we can tell, through her argument is more extreme still, because its logic does not depend on the entirety of a universal injunction. Justice Jackson appears to believe that the reasoning behind any court order demands universal adherence, at least where the executive is concerned," Barrett wrote on. So, in this case, the liberal justice just made absolutely no sense when it comes down to it, and they made clear that, hey, Congress never gave the lower courts the authority to go and make these injunctions, right? Now, the way that I see this playing out is my hope is that there is some legislation that's put forward that gives a nice balance between what we have now and what we had before this ruling when it comes to lower justices, pumping the brakes on the executive branch. I don't think they have the sole authority to go out and say absolutely on any single executive order out there, this is unconstitutional, you cannot do this. But I think that there are some circumstances in which that should be allowed. For example, if we had an executive branch that started going around saying, hey, we're going to round up everyone's guns, or we're going to force everyone in this country to go and get a vaccine, I think that is fair warrant for for lower courts to pump the brakes a little bit on that. Now, how that balance is exactly struck, I'm not sure. That's for Congress to decide. But my fear is that it opens up a door for that a president in the future will take advantage of. And it'll be interesting to see how Congress handles that decision. All right, let's move on to our next story. So from the Hill, Supreme Court upholds Obamacare preventative care mandate. Crazy that this is coming out of the Supreme Court today. Didn't even know this was on the docket. Supreme Court on Friday upheld the constitutionality of an Obamacare requirement that ensures companies cover certain preventative care recommended by an expert panel. In a 6-3 decision authored by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the justice upheld the panel's authority protecting access to preventative care for an estimated 150 million Americans. Chief Justice John Roberts, along with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, joined with Kavanaugh and the court's 3 liberal justices in the majority. So this is an interesting ruling. We have Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, and John Roberts. All 3 of which conservative justices joining with Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson in majority with Neil Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, and Justice Alito all dissenting. So we have 3 conservative dissenters and then a split court between the liberals and conservatives. Crazy with this case. This is not getting any coverage. I've not seen anyone talk about this. This is a big deal. that we have a split court case like this. And it comes down to Obamacare too, something that conservatives are wildly against. All right. The justice found that the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services has the authority to appoint and fire members of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Their work is, quote, directed and supervised by the HHS Secretary, so they do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. In siding with the Trump administration, the court reinforced the ability of HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to exert control over the panel's recommendations. They're siding with the Trump administration too. The Trump administration is holding up something that Obamacare has in it, which is crazy. Now, I'm not against this, but it's wild to see that we have the Trump administration and conservative justices, 3 of them, standing up for something about Obamacare. The health law requires insurers to cover the task force recommendations with a grade of A or B, such as cancer screenings and HIV preventative drugs. The case began when conservative Texas small business and individuals sued over the panel's recommendations that pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP medicine that is highly effective at preventing HIV be included as a mandatory preventative care service. They said covering PrEP was against their religious beliefs and would encourage homosexual behavior, intravenous drug use, and sexual activity outside of marriage between one man and one woman. A federal appeals court in New Orleans last year argued with O'Connor and ruled the task force was unconstitutional, though the ruling applied only to the challenger and was not enforced nationwide. The Biden administration appealed to the Supreme Court. The Trump White House, though, long antagonistic towards Obamacare, surprisingly chose to continue the Biden administration's defense of the law. During oral arguments, Justice Department attorneys argued the HHS secretary has the power to fire task force members and reject its recommendations, even though that power has never been exerted previously. After oral arguments, experts and court watchers felt the case was essentially a toss-up. Clearly it was. I mean, just with the way that the court ruled on this. So, let's talk about it for a minute. I'm not necessarily a fan of people being sexually promiscuous. I think that you should be monogamous in your relationships. I'm not a fan of hookup culture or people sleeping around for that matter. But when it comes down to it, I'm also not a fan of people getting HIV. HIV is a terrible, terrible disease that anyone can get for that matter. It's not just us gays that end up with it. Anyone can end up with it. They're found in the right circumstances. And I think that having access to that medication is part of having healthcare. If that's the way that you want to behave and you want to be sexually promiscuous, you have the right to do that in this country when it comes down to it. Now, many people would say, hey, if you're going to go and be a sexual deviant and go and hook up with as many people as you want, you deserve to get HIV, which I absolutely disagree with. Nobody deserves to get HIV, no matter what you've done. That's like saying you deserve to get cancer if you've been a bad person, right? That's ridiculous. You don't deserve to die from a terrible, terrible illness. Just because that's the way that you want to live your life. That's what you want to do, go for it. Wouldn't be me. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But, hey, if that's what you want to live, you should at least try and be safe doing as much as you can. So, I'm really having an issue with this. I think it's more wild that we have three of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court ruling with the 3 liberal justices on the Supreme Court. I think that's something that should be pointed out and something that should actually be applauded in that in this time of the Supreme Court, many of us feel like, hey, the liberal justices and the conservative justices never get along, or the conservative justices never rationalize what the liberal justices have to say. I've said time and time again, sometimes these justices have really dumb opinions, but when it comes down to it, they are all legal scholars in their own right. They all worked very hard to get to where they are today. Some of them may have worked harder than others. That's up for debate. But they still went through law school. They still were judges in their own right for a period of time before this. I think they deserve some form of respect. And seeing that they have the ability to work together on some cases, I think should be applauded more than it actually is. All right, move on to our next Supreme Court case. So this is Supreme Court case, I guess 3 of 4 that we're talking about today. Supreme Court upholds Texas age verification law for adult websites. Washington, the Supreme Court upheld a Texas law Friday that requires adult websites to verify age of their users, concluding that the policy does not violate the First Amendment. In a 6-3 decision, no surprise there, the High Court determined the law appropriately tailored, backing a prior Fifth Circuit Court decision that found states should be able to prevent youngsters from viewing smut online. That was a sentence right there that I don't think I would have chosen, but okay. Quote, the statute advances the state's important interest in shielding children from sexually explicit content, conservative Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in the majority opinion. Quote, and it is appropriately tailored because it permits users to verify their age through the established methods of providing government-issued identification and sharing transactional data. Texas passed the law, House Bill 1181 in 2023, applying to companies where 1/3 of the content is considered detrimental to minors. The measure stipulates that websites take reasonable age verification steps and levies a $1,000 a day penalty on violators. Pornhub had stopped operations in Texas and other states with similar laws due to concerns it couldn't comply with the age verification policy. At least 24 states had passed similar age verification laws that had been blocked by the lower courts. The Free Speech Coalition, which represents the adult entertainment industry, had sued to nix HB 1181. The New Orleans-based Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had upheld the law, promoting the Supreme Court challenge. The plaintiffs had expressed fear that the age verification rules would lead to identity theft and cause other compliance problems. But Justice Thomas wrote that the specific verification methods that HB 1181 permits are plainly legitimate. Quote, verification take place on the covered website itself or through a third-party service, he noted. Other age-restricted services such as online gambling, alcohol and tobacco sales, and car rentals rely on the same method. Thomas also brushed aside arguments that due to the stigma of pornography use, adults would not want to submit to age verification, suggesting that third-party services can ensure adequate privacy. Liberal Justice Elena Kagan wrote the dissenting for the left flank of the court. She acknowledged that, quote, no one doubts that the distribution of sexually explicit speech to children of the sort involved here can cause great harm. But she argued that the Texas law went too far. Quote, speech that is obscene for minors is often not so for adults. For them, the category of obscene and therefore unprotected speech is narrow, she wrote, so adults have a constitutional right to view the same speech that a state may prohibit for children. Quote, what if Texas could do better? What if Texas could achieve its interests without so interfering with adults' constitutionally protected rights in viewing the speech? My God. So, this should be the law in the entire United States as far as I'm concerned. All right. Online gambling. Online alcohol and tobacco purchases, even going through the airport, there's a program called Clear that many people use where you upload your passport or your ID and everything, and they do a background check on you, allows you to get through the lines of the airport faster, right? There are so many third-party services out there that verify identity. They're already in use. They're already being used by all these other services to suggest that it would be this huge infringement of the Constitution and the free speech rights of adults to use these very same services to access porn websites. I think is completely absurd. That it's somehow an infringement, that there's some sort of privacy violation of them doing just that. These sites are being used time and time again for so many other services, and nobody's complaining about that. Nobody says that there is a privacy issue when it comes to online gambling by verifying a driver's license or an ID, right? Nobody says it's an infringement when you want to go and buy alcohol online and they have to verify your ID one way or another. Hell, I had to verify my identification to be verified on X. I had to upload my driver's license to it. No one's complaining about any of those services being used. They are across the board they're across the board. They're perfectly private, and I have no issue with them whatever. Spotify Premium. I have Spotify Premium for students, right? Because I am a college student. I had to upload my student ID to a service that Spotify uses to ensure that I am, in fact, a college student. And no one is raising the alarm and saying, oh my gosh, there's this huge privacy issue because of this. No, it's only for porn. Which, by the way, the idea that porn is somehow a free speech, is somehow protected by the First Amendment under free speech rights, I think is also completely absurd. To suggest that the founding fathers were sitting around when they were writing the First Amendment and said, oh, of course, porn should be protected under free speech. It's just that was their intention. That's what they thought, is completely ridiculous. On top of that, when the First Amendment went into place, I believe several states, or almost every state, had laws on the books against porn. So the argument from Pornhub here is completely ridiculous. The fact that the 3 liberal justices were somehow against this, I think, is completely wild. This should be the law everywhere, right? There's a law in Australia that will be going into place soon that says, hey, adult websites, oh, and by the way, social media providers, you have to verify ID to allow all of your users on your websites, and you have to find a way to actively do it, either through yourself or through a third-party use. But you have to verify through identification that everyone using your service is, in fact, the proper age that we as Australia have determined. I think it's a great law. It should be the law everywhere. I think that this is great that this went through. I think this opens the door, actually, for cases against not allowing people, say, under 15 or 16 to use social media, for example, which I think also should totally be the law of the land. I think social media is super detrimental to children, just like porn is. Maybe not in the same ways, but children should not be accessing this content, right? It's just the fact of the matter. The fact that anyone could possibly be against this is completely absurd. Shame on you, justices. All right, that's all I gotta say about that one. Let's move on to our last case, and then we'll be out of here. This is from the Daily Wire. Supreme Court sides with parents, says schools can't mandate LGBT curricula. The Supreme Court ruled Friday that schools violate religious liberties when they bar parents from opting their children out of classroom instruction involving LGBT-themed books, a major win for religious conservatives. Justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines to back a group of religious parents affiliated with Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, who argued they should be able to opt their children out of lessons with LGBT themes. The Maryland parents who sued included Catholics, Muslims, and Ukrainian Orthodox. The controversial LGBT books included Prince and Knight, about a boy who falls in love with a knight instead of a princess, and Uncle Bobby's Wedding, about a girl whose uncle who marries another man. Justice Samuel Alito penned the opinion, writing that the school district burdened the parents' First Amendment rights. Quote, "Today we hold that the parents have shown that they are entitled to a preliminary injunction. A government burdens the religious exercise of parents when it requires them to submit their children to instruction that poses a very real threat of undermining the religious beliefs and practices of the parents' wish to instill," Alito wrote. Alito said the, quote, "storybook unmaskedly conveys a particular viewpoint about same-sex marriage and gender. The school board has specifically encouraged teachers to reinforce this viewpoint and to reprimand any children who disagree. That goes far beyond the mere exposure." Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote a dissent that was joined by the 2 other liberal justices, in which she criticized the court allowing, quote, "parental veto power over curricular choices along left to the Democrat process and local administrators. Quote, "The reverberations of the court's errors will be felt, I fear, for generations," Sotomayor wrote. Oh my gosh. So, what was the deal with all this? All right. So, this article is a little bit confusing. Essentially, what happened was this school said, "Hey, we're going to have a LGBTQ study session, and we're going to read these books. We're going to have, we're going to talk about gender ideology. We're going to say that boys can be girls, girls can be boys, blah 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 blah." Right? And parents, I believe in Maryland, were like, "Hey, we don't want our kids to listen to this. This is one of the only times that, what was it? Muslims and Christians and Catholics, Muslims, and Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox can come together and agree on something, right? It was like, hey, we don't really want our kids to listen to this stuff. We want to opt out of this. And the Maryland court basically said, nope, we're not going to let you do that. Your kids have to listen to this, whether they like it or not. Sorry. So parents were pissed off. They sued. They won. This is great. Now, what does this really not say? Now, the liberal justices are suggesting in their dissent that this is going to mean that parents can now say, hey, we want to opt out of teaching our kids about evolution. We want to opt out of teaching our kids about this, that, and the other. We want to opt out about our kids learning about Auger v. Hodge, the Supreme Court case that solidified same-sex marriage in the United States. We want to opt out of all that stuff. Right? We want to opt out of anything that we necessarily don't agree with. That's not what this case says that they can do. It says they can opt out of basically extra material, right? Learning about a Supreme Court case in school, not something you can opt out of, right? Pretty obvious that you can't. No issues there. But being read books that say that boys can be girls or girls can be boys, all that is something you can opt out of, right? Or sex ed for that matter, right? If you don't want your kid to listen to sex ed from some lived out teacher at your local public school, you should be able to opt out of that, right? If I want to teach my kids about sex in the way that I want them to hear about it, in the way that I feel is appropriate for them, at the appropriate age for them, for that matter, I don't want their school to be telling them otherwise, right? So with that, that is all I have to say today. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Spin Cycle Live. We'll be back here on Monday with another great episode for you all. Maybe even more Supreme Court rulings by then. But make sure you're following me at HomoNation on all the social media platforms: X, YouTube, Instagram, Rumble, TikTok, all of them. Follow me on there. Follow the show on there. Share the show with friends. Tell people how great my opinions are. I have the greatest opinions on the whole wide internet. You better believe it. And with that, we are out. I've been Nathan Hale. This has been Spin Cycle Live. Peace out.